Killing Hitler is something that has occupied the minds of many alternate history theorists. There were many different attempts to kill the angry mustache model before and during World War II, all of which would produce different scenarios based on who killed him, why, how, and the planned aftermath, as well as the regime's reactions. But perhaps the most famous attempt to kill Hitler was the July Plot. The July Plot, sometimes referred to as Operation Valkyrie, was a failed attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime on the 20th of July 1944. The plotters were part of the German resistance, mainly composed of Wehrmacht officers, and the leader of the conspiracy, Klaus von Stauffenberg, had tried to kill Hitler by detonating an explosive hidden in a briefcase. However, due to the location of the bomb at the time of the detonation, the blast only dealt Hitler minor injuries. Meanwhile, the planners were then subsequently attempted a coup, and this would fail and resulted in the purge of the Wehrmacht. Operation Valkyrie was an emergency continuity of government operations plan issued to the Territorial Reserve Army of Germany to implement in the event of the general breakdown in national civil order due to Allied bombing of German cities or an uprising of the millions of foreign forced laborers working within German factories. German army officers Friedrich Ulbricht, General Major Heinen von Teskau, and Klaus von Stauffenberg modified this plan with the intention of using it to take control of German cities, disarming the SS, and arrest the Nazi leadership once Hitler had been assassinated in the July Plot. The aim of the coup d'etat attempt was, of course, to take political control of Germany and its armed forces from the Nazi Party and SS, and to make peace with the Western Allies as soon as possible. The details of the conspirators' peace plans remain largely unknown, but they would have included unrealistic demands for the confirmation of Germany's existence and excessive annexations of European territory, which I'll elaborate on a little bit later, but first the coup has to be successful before peace negotiations can even start. Changes to make in an alternate timeline to make the July Plot a success would have to start with Hitler actually being killed by Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb. Say the meeting isn't moved and Stauffenberg perfectly places the bomb and the timing goes off perfectly as well, so Hitler is blown to bits. Hitler's death is kind of an obvious essential condition for the plot to be successful, but there are other conditions to be successful as well as for the plot to succeed in seizing power alone to work. Operation Valkyrie changes to make would be if the Reserve Army successfully arrests all SS leadership, which it was directed to do by the plotters. Of course, since Hitler is dead, nobody can convince the Reserve Army that Hitler is still alive like in our timeline to cause the coup to fail. With that, however, all the players will be seeking to take power, including Himmler and the SS, as well as Goering, and others from the Mustache Man's inner circle. But let's say somehow all of these people are forced out of power, or at least the running, and everything works out well for the plotters, and they seize power. What's their government going to look like? The planned new government would see General Ludwig Beck assuming the role of Reichswehrwesser, or head of state. There was also a 12-point program for the new government. Among them were the restoration of the rule of law, independence of the courts, protection of personnel and property security, disillusionment of concentration camps, and prevention of lynch law. There was also the reduction of bureaucracy, examination and possible punishment, dismissal, or transfer of all officials appointed and promoted from January 1st, 1933, especially Nazi Party members. Again, there were a bunch of other points and stuff that was going to go on, but one interesting thing was the continuation of the war was planned as a defensive war only as a means so that they can negotiate with the Western Allies. The plotters initially planned for a peace towards the Allies requiring the re-establishment of Germany's 1914 borders with Belgium, France, and Poland, and no reparations. Like most of the rest of Germany's resistance, the July plotters believed in the idea of Greater Germany, and as a condition for peace, demanded that the Western Allies recognize as a minimum the incorporation of Austria, Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, and the annexation of Polish inhabited territories that Germany ceded to Poland after 1918, with the restoration of some of their overseas colonies as well being a demand. The new government also planned to put on trial many Nazi war criminals and many SS members for atrocities as well. With all of this, how would the German public react? Remember, just because a certain group or party is in power doesn't mean that they are automatically all supported by everyone. So I think a lot of the population will be very confused for the most part. While many Germans disliked the Nazis, many others were fanatical supporters. I don't think it's too out there to say that some kind of German partisan war movement might ensue against the new government. Also, things are going to be very messy and chaotic because this is summer of 1944, where quite a few Germans still think that somehow they can win the war. The Allied response to the coup is going to be quite mixed. You see, on the one hand, Hitler is dead, which is great, and now there's a government seeking peace. But the Allies had wanted an unconditional surrender from Germany, and many of the demands from the plotters were quite unreasonable, especially with German annexations and the idea of no war reparations. The Allies, in my opinion, would be a little confused about how to proceed. Perhaps they would suggest a mass surrender on the Western Front to US and British forces, but certain German units will still be wanting to fight because this is summer of 1944, like I said. The Soviet response, on the other hand, is still going to be rather hostile. First, the Soviets were still going to march straight to Berlin no matter who was in charge. Second, many members of the new government were actually kind of okay with still fighting against the Soviets. This will also put the Allies in a very weird spot, as Germans are barely fighting the Western Allies and are mostly going east because the new government wants peace with the West. This whole thing would, of course, be a geopolitical mess, but negotiations between all parties are gonna try to continue as fighting still goes through winter of 1944. Like I said before, the Allies wanted an unconditional German surrender and didn't want to accept anything less than that. Additionally, a lot of the plotters' demands for territory were really unreasonable. Keeping that in mind, one change in this timeline is that I'd say a lot of Germans will be surrendering, and the new government will also be transferring many troops to fight against the Soviets. The Allies will keep pushing through Europe, meeting relatively light resistance as the Soviets face fierce resistance and are further delayed. Although a conditioned peace will not be occurring, the end of World War II in Europe in this timeline would, in my opinion, come in early 1945, in January if it even lasts that long, where the Western Allies are going to get a lot more of Germany and Czechoslovakia. The Balkans are kind of unknown, but this timeline will see a lot more hostile relationship between the West and the Soviets by 1946, because the Soviets are mad that the coup government wanted to surrender to the Western Allies, and pretty much will in this timeline, while they would still have fought the Soviets. This is all just one possible scenario, but what do you think would have happened had the July 20th plot and Operation Valkyrie succeeded? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.